Hello again, Burst users. This is Florence Nguyen Kwong, and I'm with the Center for Early Reading at Amplify. This video provides you with insight on how to get Burst started at your school. We're breaking up this module into two parts. The first session will last about 25 minutes. Implementing Burst for School Leaders is the last of the School Leaders series. This module assumes that you have watched the Burst Overview module. If you haven't watched that video yet, take some time to view it prior to viewing this module. Also, make sure that the handout is ready. We will review it as we go. Prior to this module, you learned about Burst and how it works. Today, you will learn more about how Burst fits into your intervention framework, choose your intervention coordinator, and set up your start and end date for Burst intervention. By intervention services, we mean the way intervention is managed and run at your school. We're phrasing this as intervention services because we're referring to the ways in which we serve students depending on their skills and deficits in content or behavior areas. For today's module, we will focus only on reading intervention services. First, let's take a look at your existing intervention services and how Burst will fit in. Before we get started, let's reflect on what you did last school year before you had Burst. What was your approach to reading intervention prior to Burst? Which programs did you use? How did you determine which students received which interventions? Pause the video and record your responses on page 1 of your handout. What we often hear is the concept of tiers. As many of you know, many advocate for having multiple tiers of instruction. Core instruction, which all students get, and then tier 2 and 3 intervention, which is reserved for some, but not all students. Let's first define some of these different categories before we describe how they look in each tier of instruction and intervention. Student profile is a student's reading level and risk profile, which indicates the level of support needed to reach benchmark. Scope of instruction is the content of the instruction or intervention. Delivery mode is how the instruction is delivered, whether whole or small group, with an instructor or online. Group size is how many students per group. Frequency and dose refers to how often per week students receive the intervention or instruction, and for how many minutes per day. The duration of instruction generally refers to how many weeks the instruction lasts. Let's see how these are different in terms of who fits in each tier and what the instruction looks like. Later, we will also provide examples of different curriculum programs that fit into each tier. For now, let's just discuss how each category differs under a different tier. As you know, all students receive Tier 1 instruction. This is where the grade level content is delivered to all of your students, typically via whole class and small group rotations. For some students, Tier 1 instruction is not enough. They need additional instruction below grade level or on previously taught grade level content if there is any chance to catch them up. You identify these students with screeners such as M-Class DIBELS. They have usually been identified with a below benchmark or well below benchmark risk profile. And Tier 2 intervention is usually taught in small groups of 4 to 5 students, 3 to 5 times a week for a 30-minute session. Per RTI or MTSS standards, Tier 2 intervention happens in addition to Tier 1 core instruction. This means that it takes place at a separate time from the core literacy block. Some students need something beyond Tier 2 intervention. These are students who are making progress, but not at a fast enough rate to be caught up by the end of the year. They need a higher intensity, more minutes, or the same number of minutes, but in a smaller group. Others are students who did not respond to the Tier 2 program in place, and they might need a different program altogether, one maybe with a different set of pedagogies. This table is on page 2 of your handout packet for reference. We just went over the different tiers of intervention and how they differ. You probably have different programs, some of which may fall under different tiers. How do you decide what intervention each student needs? The first step in determining which intervention program to use is to think about the student profile. Here are some parameters to take into consideration when deciding the focus of instruction. Think about what specific skills gap the student has. Assessment results help to identify gaps such as decoding or comprehension skills gap. But sometimes you may identify other gaps only after the student has gone through a few cycles of intervention. If the student is an English language learner, the focus of instruction might need to be on developing basic communication skills or on academic language. Once you determine the right focus of instruction for the student, Think about how far behind is the student. Is the student on track to reaching end of year benchmark goals with the existing level of support he or she is receiving? This will help you make adjustments to the tier, either with higher intensity or frequency, or possibly with a group size. Finally, if the student already has an IEP, this will help give guidance as to the intervention he or she will receive. We've reviewed what core instruction should look like and how tiers 2 and 3 interventions fit into the picture. And we just talked about the focus of instruction and tier. Let's do an activity together. Follow along on page 3 of your handout. Pause this video and complete page 3 of your handout, which has the student profiles, and decide which tier of intervention and programs to give the student. Once you are done, press play again, and we will go over what we should give the student in terms of instruction or intervention, intensity, and program. All right, let's take a look at the student profiles and what tier of instruction and programs we should give them. We will assume that the student profile describes the child's reading skills or level, which you got from your screener. What tier of instruction and program would you recommend for a student who is at level or higher? Students who are at level or higher will most likely continue on their trajectory to reaching end of the year goals with just a regular core instruction. How about for students who are at risk and just started receiving Tier 2 intervention? We need to give these students a few weeks of Tier 2 intervention and see how they respond. Tier 2 intervention should be a program in addition to the core literacy program, such as Burst, which is taught in small groups of 5 students for 30 minutes daily. How about what tier of instruction and program would you recommend for a student who is at risk, receiving Tier 2 intervention, and who is on track to reaching benchmark by end of the year? Since these students are making adequate progress to reaching end of the year goals with the Tier 2 intervention you've provided, we would recommend to keep what you have in place, which should be something similar to 30 minutes of daily intervention in a small group of 5 students, in addition to the core literacy program. What if the student was at risk and responsive to the Tier 2 intervention given, but was off track to reach benchmark by the end of the year? If the data show that the student is making growth, but not fast enough to catch up to reach end of the year goals, we would adjust the intervention to Tier 3 and either lower the number of students per group to 3 students, which gives each student more opportunities to practice and receive teacher feedback, and or increase the intervention time to 60 minutes daily. What if the student was at risk and not responsive to the Tier 2 intervention given? What would we do? If the student is not showing any progress in Tier 2 intervention, something is not working for the student, so we need to adjust things and place him or her in Tier 3 intervention. This would likely be a different Tier 3 program with a different approach, modality, or pedagogy from the one used in Tier 2. What tier of instruction and program would you recommend for an English language learner student who is at risk, just started receiving Tier 2 intervention, and needs oral language development? Similarly to a native English speaker, we would need to give these students a few weeks of Tier 2 intervention for 30 minutes daily in small groups of 5 to 1 and see how they respond. In addition to Tier 2 intervention, these students likely need an oral language development program for 30 minutes daily to help them develop listening and speaking skills. In short, students who are at risk should stay in Tier 2 if they're responsive and on track to reaching end of the year goals. If they are either not responsive to this Tier 2 program or not on track, then you would need to consider switching their level of intensity to Tier 3. Burst can be used for grades K-6. Let's figure out which grade levels you will use Burst for at your school. Burst is not grade specific and is adaptive. It can cover skills above or below students' current skill level. With that in mind, how do you decide which grade levels will get Burst? Instead of thinking of Burst as grade specific, think about what each student needs and the skills that Burst addresses. The first step is to look at the student data and build a profile. Use the table from the activity we just finished to help guide you in choosing the right tier of instruction and programs for each student profile at your school. Look at the skills and focus of each program you have and determine which is most appropriate for each student profile. Recall that the Burst Continuum focuses on beginning reading skills such as phonological awareness and early decoding skills and goes all the way to fluency in reading comprehension. Other programs you have may also span several grade levels. Based on their focus, you may want to select which program might best suit each student profile. Some programs may focus on early phonological awareness and decoding skills. These will be most appropriate for K2 or K3 students. Others may only focus on reading comprehension, which may be more appropriate for students who already have decoding skills, likely in grades 2 and 3 or above. Here's an example of how one school integrated BURST into its intervention program. This is also on page 4 of your handout for your reference. Let's focus on the lower grades first. This school uses CKLA for K3 for Tier 1 core instruction in literacy and Lexia and Boost as supplements to the core. They have a couple of time blocks on Tuesdays and Thursdays when they're not doing specials such as music, PE, and art. And that is when they fit Lexia and do Boost in their schedule. BURST and Mondo's oral language program are used for Tier 2 interventions. These interventions are in addition to the Tier 1 core instruction and take place outside of the core literacy block. You see that the school was very specific in the student profiles that qualify for each of these two intervention programs so that students get the right intervention. Students who need extra support with reading skills are placed into BURST, and those who need extra support on developing their oral language skills are placed in Mondo's oral language program. Sometimes that is in addition to receiving BURST. So if their profile shows a need for Tier 2 intervention in reading and oral language development, they would be placed in both programs. Students not responsive to Tier 2 interventions are placed in a Tier 3 intervention. Tier 3 intervention here can mean different things. For students who are responsive to BURST but need higher intensity to stay on track or to accelerate their learning, Tier 3 could mean smaller group size of 3 students or receiving 1 hour of BURST daily instead of the regular 30-minute BURST lesson. For students who are not responsive to BURST and not making any progress in BURST, an alternate program such as the LIPS program might be implemented. At this school, there's only one intervention teacher trained on the Lindenwood program, as only a few students qualify for this program. For the upper grades, students get CKLA for Tier 1 core instruction in literacy and Lexia as a supplement to the core. BURST is used for Tier 2 interventions and takes place outside of the core literacy block. They only use BURST because none of the grade 4 to 6 students need support on their oral language development. And BURST addresses exactly what the grade 4 to 6 students' skills needs are on decoding and comprehension skills. Students who are not responsive to BURST are placed in a Tier 3 intervention. In this school, the Tier 3 intervention for grades 4 to 6 is actually a replacement program. Read 180 replaces CKLA for grades 4 to 6 students who receive Tier 3 intervention. We've laid the foundation for intervention services and talked about the different tiers of instruction, programs, and building profiles to determine which tier and programs might best suit individual student needs. Let's discuss a few common pitfalls to managing and running intervention services. All students should get differentiated instruction that matches their skill needs, whether they are behind or advanced. Small group instruction that happens in the core literacy block should not count as an intervention, as all students should get this support. A Tier 2 or 3 intervention should take place in addition to whatever takes place in the core literacy block. Students must first start with a Tier 2 intervention. A Tier 2 intervention might be enough to close the gap the student has, and we need to think about how to get the student caught up with minimal interruptions to the rest of the curriculum. If students are not progressing at a rate that will get them to reach end of year goals with the Tier 2 intervention, there should be adjustments to the services provided. This usually entails a Tier 3 intervention with additional intervention time, smaller group size, and/or a different instructional approach. Student data need to be consistently collected and reviewed. Without reviewing progress monitoring data, there is no way to know whether or not the intervention services are the right ones for each student, whether there needs to be adjustments in intervention groups or even in intervention services. Oftentimes, students who are below or well below benchmark are behind their peers not because of a learning disability, but because the instruction did not match their needs the first time around. There's a plethora of reasons why the student may not have gotten it the first time around, and intervention services aim to find the right means for the students to access the content and get caught up. Students need to receive consistent intervention and may need adjustments to the tiers or programs, which may take time. Before you update your intervention services, here are some key takeaways to think about. Be sure to use 3 tiers of instruction and define what each tier entails so that there is no confusion or overlap.
Review your school's student profiles and group students based on their similar skill needs. Be intentional about each program you include in your intervention services. Some programs are only pedagogically appropriate for certain grade levels. Others span across grades but may only cover specific isolated skills. Be sure to choose each child's intervention services and program based on the skill gaps he or she has and how well the programs will address the student's needs. Here's a tip: build student profiles for your school population, review your programs, and see which ones will truly address the skill gaps you've identified. For beginning readers, there are generally three areas which might hold them back: reading skills, oral language development, and English language acquisition. Be sure to provide intervention services in each of these areas as necessary. Have clear criteria for how students qualify for each tier of intervention or instruction. Building student profiles based on your school data can really help with this. Finally, provide bursts to all students who are at risk and keep track of their progress towards end of the year goals so that you can make adjustments to the intensity of their intervention services as necessary. Set a time frame for the intervention, which is typically 6 to 8 weeks, and after the 6 to 8 weeks, review data for the target skills. Reflect on whether or not the intervention worked and refine it. You can revise the groups and repeat the process as necessary.
Now let's take a few moments to lay out how your school will use its various programs, including Burst. You're going to refer to your handout, pages 5 and 6. First, we will work on building student profiles for students at your school. This is on page 5 of your handout. Use the guiding reflection questions here at the bottom of the page to help you describe the specific student profiles at your school and categorize which programs might match each student profile. For example, think about the components of your core literacy block and whether it includes any small group instruction, differentiation, and whether you might have supplemental resources or programs. For example, if you have guided reading groups, which mainly address comprehension skills, what do you have in place for students who need help with foundational skills? Burst might be the answer here. Think about which student profiles qualify for Tier 2 and 3 intervention. So look at your student data, and do you have a high population of English language learners? Do many of your students need additional oral language development? Build out the different student profiles based on your own school demographics and data. Once you have developed your student profiles, think about the programs that you have access to and think about how these profiles and student needs and how each program will address their needs. We need to have clarity and be intentional about when and how to use each of the programs. Then go ahead and go to page 6 of your handout. Here you will articulate how your programs might dovetail together. For example, might one program strongly focus on comprehension skills? If so, this program might not be enough to target students whose profiles show a need for skills-based instruction. In this case, Burst would be the answer. Or you may have a program that is best taught one-on-one. This might be great for students who are not responsive to Tier 2 instruction and need a different approach. Lay out how your school will use Burst and other programs you have in place. This table should help get a picture of what your intervention services will look like for each tier of instruction. Congratulations! We've gotten through our first objective. Feel free to take more time to complete pages 5 and 6 of your handout and continue on to part 2 of this module as soon as you're ready. On part 2 of the module, we will help you get the ball rolling by choosing an intervention coordinator and setting up your benchmark assessment windows. See you soon!